The restaurant was one of those places people only saw in magazines or passed by from the outside, wondering what it felt like inside. Golden lights glowed softly from the crystal chandeliers, and gentle music played in the background, mixing with the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of wealthy voices. Every table looked perfect, fresh flowers, shining cutlery, and food that seemed too beautiful to eat. Among the servers walking swiftly between the tables was a young waitress, her uniform neat but slightly worn from daily use. Her steps were quick, practiced, and careful. She never let the tray shake in her hands even when it carried heavy glasses or hot dishes. Every movement was filled with quiet grace, though nobody really noticed. For most guests, she was just another face in the background, someone to bring what they wanted and disappear without a sound. She had worked there for almost a year. Every day started early and ended late. When the city still slept, she was already awake, tying her hair and getting ready for another long shift. She didn't complain. Work was her lifeline. It kept food on the table for her small family and paid for her younger brother's school fees. Life hadn't been easy, but she had learned to smile through the tiredness. She didn't have many friends at work. Most of the staff came and went, unable to handle the pressure. She stayed quiet, polite, and focused. The manager liked her for that. "You're reliable," he once said, and though it was a simple word, it meant something to her. It meant she was seen, even if just a little. But what no one knew was that long before she ever carried trays and cleaned tables, she had dreamed of being on a stage, not as a singer or an actress, but as a pianist. Music had once been her language, her joy, and her escape. As a little girl, she used to sit for hours at an old upright piano in her grandmother's house, pressing the keys carefully, amazed at how they could speak without words. Her grandmother had been the first to notice her gift. "You feel the music?" her grandmother used to say softly. "That's something no one can teach." Years later, life had other plans. After her grandmother passed away, there was no one left who could afford her piano lessons. Her family's small business struggled, bills piled up, and she quietly set her dream aside. When she took the job as a waitress, she promised herself she wouldn't think about the piano anymore. Dreams didn't pay rent, but sometimes when the restaurant's pianist played softly in the evenings, she would pause behind a curtain for a few seconds listening, feeling that familiar ache in her heart. On this particular evening, the restaurant was more crowded than usual. It was hosting a private charity dinner for some of the city's most powerful people. The owner had been preparing for weeks. Every chair was polished, every glass spotless, every staff member warned to be perfect. Mistakes were not allowed tonight. The young waitress moved carefully between tables, carrying wine and desserts. She tried not to look at the guests too much, though it was impossible not to notice them. There were famous businessmen, artists, and politicians all talking loudly, their laughter echoing through the hall. Their conversations were filled with expensive words: investments, art deals, properties, travel plans. She didn't envy them. She just felt distant, like watching a world she didn't belong to. As she set a plate on one of the tables, a man in a designer suit made a joke that drew laughter from everyone around him. His smile was sharp, his tone confident. He noticed her standing there quietly and gave her a look that made her uncomfortable, as if she were invisible and yet too visible at the same time. She lowered her gaze politely and turned away, focusing on her next task. A few moments later, she returned to pour wine at the same table. Her hands were steady, but the table was crowded, and one of the guests suddenly shifted his chair without warning. The bottle tilted slightly, and a few drops of wine fell onto a guest's napkin. The sound was barely audible, but it was enough. "Oh, look at that," one of them said loudly.
"Careful, or we might need a lifeguard for this flood."
Laughter broke out around the table. The young waitress froze for a second, her heart dropping. She quickly apologized, grabbing a clean napkin to replace the stained one. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. But the laughter didn't stop. One woman shook her head dramatically. "I hope she doesn't spill on my dress next," she said with a smirk. The sound of laughter felt louder than it was. Even though she kept her face calm, her hands felt cold. She apologized again, placed the wine bottle down carefully, and stepped back. For the guests, it was just a small joke, something to laugh about. For her, it was a sting that cut deep. When she walked back toward the kitchen, her manager noticed her expression. "What happened?" he asked under his breath. "Just a small spill," she replied quickly, forcing a small smile. She didn't want trouble. Be careful, he said in a low voice. Tonight's not the night for mistakes. She nodded. Yes, sir. Inside the kitchen, she took a deep breath and leaned against the counter for a second. Her heart was still racing. She had learned long ago not to let emotions show while working, but sometimes it was hard. She thought about how easily people judged others, without knowing their stories, without realizing how hard they were trying. She wished just for a moment that they could see her for who she really was, not just the uniform she wore. After a few minutes, she returned to the dining hall. The guests were still chatting loudly, and the sound of laughter floated through the air. Near the corner of the room stood a large grand piano shining under the soft lights. Usually a professional pianist came in the evenings to play gentle melodies while guests dined, but tonight the musician hadn't arrived yet. The piano sat there quietly, waiting. As she passed by it, she couldn't help but glance at it for a moment. It was beautiful, smooth, polished, and perfect. For a few seconds, she forgot everything else. Her fingers twitched slightly as if remembering the feel of the keys. She moved on quickly, pretending not to notice. But deep inside, something stirred. Later that night, while refilling glasses, she overheard one of the guests mention the missing pianist. "What's the point of this piano if no one plays it?" Another joked. "Maybe one of the waitresses can entertain us." The table laughed again, and before she could move away, one of the same guests who had mocked her earlier turned his head and said with a grin, "You there? You want to play for us? You seem careful with your hands." The words hit her like a challenge wrapped in sarcasm. The people around him chuckled, expecting her to blush, apologize, and walk away. But she didn't. She just stood there, her hands holding the tray close to her chest. "I used to play a little," she said quietly. The laughter softened for a second. The man raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? Then maybe you should prove it." His tone was mocking, but something inside her refused to shrink away this time. She glanced at the piano again, feeling her heart beat faster. She didn't want to cause trouble, but a part of her whispered, "Why not?" It had been so long since she'd touched real keys. Before she could think too much, she took a slow breath and said, "If it's all right, I can play one song." The manager, hearing the conversation from a distance, froze. He hurried over, whispering urgently, "What are you doing?" "This isn't," but the guest interrupted. "Let her play. Let's see what our talented waitress can do." The laughter returned, but softer this time, mixed with curiosity. The manager hesitated, then sighed. "Just one piece," he said quietly. She nodded and walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. The chatter behind her sounded far away, fading under the sound of her heartbeat. When she reached the piano, she placed the tray down carefully and sat on the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. For a moment, she closed her eyes. The memories came rushing back. Her grandmother's smile, the small old piano, the feeling of freedom when she played. Then she pressed the first key. The soft note rang through the room like a whisper. No one expected it, but the sound changed everything. The laughter stopped. Conversations paused. Every head turned toward her. Her fingers began to move again, one note following another, gentle and flowing like a story being told without words. And though the crowd didn't yet realize it, that first simple melody was about to change the entire night. When the first note touched the air, something inside the room shifted. It was a soft sound, but it carried a strange kind of strength, a calm that spread slowly through the crowd. The young waitress sat with her back straight, her fingers trembling slightly at first, then finding courage as they moved across the keys. She didn't think about the people behind her or the expensive room around her. For the first time in years, she simply played. Her music was quiet but full of feeling, flowing like a memory returning to life. The tune carried a sense of longing, the kind that comes from dreams lost and found again. At first, the guests only listened out of curiosity. Some leaned back with faint smiles, still expecting a mistake or a few random notes. But as the melody grew, something changed in their expressions. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago faded. Glasses stopped clinking. The hum of conversation died out completely. The sound of her playing wrapped around the walls, soft but deep, echoing through every corner of the restaurant. The waiters near the door stopped moving for a moment, turning their heads. Even the manager, who had been nervous about the situation, stood frozen, his eyes fixed on her. The woman at the table who had mocked her earlier now sat still, her hand resting on her chin, eyes following every movement of the waitress's fingers. There was something raw in the way the girl played, not just skill but emotion. It was as if she wasn't performing for anyone but speaking through the piano, telling her story note by note. She didn't look up even once. Her eyes stayed closed for a few moments, then opened slowly, focusing on the keys as her hands moved with grace and precision. Every sound seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her heart. The man who had dared her to play leaned back, his confident smile gone. He tried to say something, but no words came out. Each key she pressed carried a memory, the mornings she woke before sunrise, the nights she came home exhausted, the quiet tears she hid when life felt too heavy. All those feelings turned into sound, and the piano became her voice. The music built softly like waves rising and falling. There was sadness in it, but also hope. It was like a storm that eventually turned into calm. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, no one dared to move. The only sound was the piano and the faint breathing of people who had forgotten everything else. Their food, their conversations, even their phones lying untouched on the tables. The candlelight flickered slightly, casting warm shadows on her face. Her expression was calm now, almost peaceful. For the first time that night, she didn't feel like a waitress. She didn't feel small or invisible. She felt alive, like the person she used to be when music was her world. When she finished the last note, it lingered in the air for a long moment before fading away. Then came silence, complete silence. It was as if the room itself needed time to breathe again. No one clapped at first, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. They were too moved, too caught up in the spell of it. Then slowly, the sound of hands coming together filled the air, growing louder, stronger, until the room was filled with applause. The young waitress looked up, startled. She hadn't expected that. Her eyes widened and she almost looked unsure what to do. She stood slowly, gave a small, shy smile, and bowed slightly. The guests rose to their feet, clapping harder. Even the manager standing near the door joined in. The same people who had laughed at her a few minutes ago were now applauding her with real admiration. Some even had tears glistening in their eyes. The man in the suit who had challenged her to play looked down, embarrassed. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a kind of quiet respect. He turned toward her and said softly, "That was incredible." She gave a polite nod, still too overwhelmed to speak. The woman beside him whispered, "She wasn't just playing, she was feeling every note." After a moment, the applause faded, replaced by quiet murmurs of amazement. The waitress stepped away from the piano, her hand still trembling slightly, not from fear but from the rush of emotion. She picked up her tray again, trying to return to work as if nothing had happened, but the guests didn't let her fade into the background this time. A few stood up to thank her personally. One of them said gently, "You have a gift. You shouldn't be serving tables." Her cheeks turned pink. She smiled politely, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm just happy you liked it." But as she walked away, her heart felt light in a way it hadn't for years. In the kitchen, her co-workers gathered around her, their eyes wide. "We didn't know you could play like that," one of them said. She shrugged shyly, setting down her tray. "It's been a long time." "Long time or not," another whispered. "You played like someone born for it." Even the manager, who rarely praised anyone, gave a small smile. "You surprised everyone out there," he said. "I've never seen that room so quiet." She thanked him, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Inside, she felt something stir. Not pride exactly, but a quiet reminder of who she was. The part of her that had been hidden for years had just stepped into the light again, even if only for a few minutes. When her shift ended later that night, the restaurant had returned to its usual calm, but the air still carried traces of what had happened. A few guests lingered longer than usual, talking softly about the waitress who had played the piano. Some said she should be performing on a real stage. Others wondered where she had learned to play like that. She slipped out the back door, her coat pulled tight against the cool night air. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and she could still feel the piano keys under her fingertips, even though she was no longer playing. The sound of the applause echoed in her mind, soft but real. As she walked down the quiet street toward the small apartment she shared with her family, she felt an unfamiliar feeling. Hope. For the first time in years, it didn't feel impossible to dream again. Maybe she couldn't change her whole life overnight, but maybe, just maybe, music wasn't gone from her forever. When she reached home, the lights were dim, and her brother was already asleep at the small table covered with his school books. She covered him with a blanket and smiled faintly. Her mother looked up from the old sofa, her tired eyes softening when she saw her daughter's expression. "You look different tonight," her mother said gently. "Something good happened?" The waitress hesitated, then nodded. "I played the piano again." Her mother's eyes widened slightly, then a small smile appeared on her face. "You used to love that. How did it feel?" She thought for a moment, searching for the right word. "Like coming home," she said finally. Her mother reached out and squeezed her hand. "Maybe this is a sign," she whispered. "Maybe it's time to remember what you were meant to do." That night, lying on her bed, the young woman stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. She replayed the moment in her mind, the laughter, the challenge, the first note, the silence that followed. It all felt like a dream, but it was real. She smiled to herself. For years, she had carried the weight of forgotten dreams, believing they no longer mattered. But that evening had shown her something important. That no matter how life changes, the things that truly belong to you never leave. They wait quietly, like a song waiting to be played again. As she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the piano once more, its soft notes blending with her heartbeat. And though she didn't know it yet, that simple performance, born from courage and pain, was about to change everything. The next morning, the restaurant felt different. The air wasn't just filled with the smell of coffee and baked bread, it carried whispers. People were still talking about what had happened the night before. Staff members who hadn't been on shift heard the story from those who had seen it. Everyone had their version to tell, each one adding their own amazement to the tale. "She just sat and played," one cook said while slicing vegetables. "You should have seen the faces of those fancy guests. They were like statues." "She's been working here all this time and we never knew," another replied, shaking his head. "Who would have thought?" In the corner, the young waitress quietly tied her apron, pretending not to hear. Her cheeks warmed every time someone mentioned her, but she stayed silent. She didn't like too much attention, it made her nervous. She just wanted to do her job as usual, but nothing was really usual anymore. When the manager saw her, he gave a small nod. His voice softened when he said, "You did something special last night." The owner heard about it. He was impressed. She smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," he said, half smiling. "You earned it." As she walked into the main hall with a tray in her hands, she noticed how some of the guests from the night before were already there again. They recognized her. A few smiled, some waved slightly. One woman even stopped her and said, "You have no idea how much your music touched me." The waitress didn't know what to say. She just smiled and nodded politely, her heart full but her words few. By the end of her shift, she realized how quickly stories could travel. A guest who worked for a local newspaper had been there the previous night. He had written a small article about the unknown waitress who silenced the elite with her piano. It wasn't meant to be a big story, just a human moment that touched hearts. But the next day, people started sharing it online. By evening, hundreds of people had seen it. Some posted comments saying how inspiring it was. Others wrote about their own forgotten dreams. It spread like quiet fire. Not wild, not noisy, but warm and steady. She didn't know any of this until the next day when her coworker showed her the article on a phone. Her picture wasn't there, only a short line describing her performance. Still reading the words made her chest tighten with emotion. "I didn't think people would care," she whispered. "Care?" her coworker said, smiling. "You reminded people that talent doesn't wear uniforms." That night, as she walked home again through the city lights, she felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. Part of her was happy that people appreciated her music, but another part worried about attention. She wasn't ready for fame or interviews. She just wanted to live quietly, to help her family. At home, her mother was waiting by the window. "I saw the article," she said softly, her voice full of pride. "I knew your music would find its way back." The waitress sat down beside her mother and held her hand. "It's just a small story. It'll fade soon." Her mother smiled knowingly. "Maybe, but sometimes one small story can open big doors." She didn't believe it then. But a few days later, something happened that changed her mind. It was late afternoon when the restaurant phone rang. The manager took the call, then came out looking surprised. "Someone's asking about you," he said to the waitress. "Me?" she asked, confused. "Yes. They want to speak with the waitress who played the piano." Her heart skipped a beat. "Who is it?" "They said they're from a music academy. They saw the article and want to meet you." She stood still, unsure how to respond. "A music academy?" she repeated softly, as if saying it might make it more real. The manager nodded. "They want you to visit next week. Maybe they think you can audition or something." "You should go." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts running in circles. The idea of walking into a real music academy again felt unreal. She hadn't touched a piano seriously in years. What if she wasn't good enough anymore? What if they expected too much? But deep down another voice whispered, "What if this is your second chance?" The next few days passed in a blur. Between shifts she practiced whenever she could. The restaurant pianist, an older man with kind eyes, offered to let her use the instrument after hours. "You have something rare," he told her one evening. "You don't just play, you feel. That's what music is really about." She practiced until her fingers hurt, losing track of time. Some nights she forgot to eat. Her co-workers teased her lightly, but they were proud of her too. Everyone seemed to believe in her, even when she doubted herself. When the day of the academy visit arrived, she woke early. Her hands trembled as she tied her hair. She wore her neatest clothes, nothing fancy but clean and simple. On the way there, she kept her eyes on the passing buildings, trying to calm her nerves. The academy building was tall and beautiful, filled with the faint sounds of music echoing from different rooms. Pianos, violins, voices, all blending into a soft symphony. She stood at the entrance for a moment, afraid to step in. It felt like walking into her past. A woman from the administration greeted her kindly and led her to a small concert room where a few teachers were waiting. "We heard about you," one of them said, smiling warmly. "We'd love to hear you play something." She nodded, swallowing her nerves. The piano in the room looked familiar, grand and shining like the one in the restaurant. She sat down, closed her eyes, and let her fingers find their place. At first her hands trembled slightly, but as soon as she began, the music took over. The same calm she had felt that night returned. She forgot the room, the people, the fear. It was just her and the piano again. When she finished, there was silence. Then one of the teachers spoke softly. "You play with soul. That's something we can't teach." The others nodded in agreement. "You have natural talent. Would you like to study here? We can help you with a scholarship." Her eyes widened. "A scholarship?" "Yes," one teacher said gently. "Your story touched many people. We want to give you a chance to grow." For a moment she couldn't speak. Tears filled her eyes and she covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." When she walked out of the academy, the city seemed brighter. She felt light, almost like she was floating. For years she had believed her dream was gone forever, buried under work and responsibility. But now it was alive again. That evening she went straight to the restaurant, smiling wider than anyone had ever seen her smile. Her co-workers gathered around her, eager to know what happened. "They gave me a scholarship," she said softly, still in disbelief. The kitchen erupted in cheers. Even the manager clapped her on the back. "You deserve it," he said proudly. "Now don't you dare waste it." She laughed through her tears, her heart full. For the first time in years, she could see a future that wasn't just about surviving. It was about living. That night, as she walked home under the streetlights, she thought about everything that had happened. A single act of courage, sitting at that piano when everyone laughed, had changed her entire path. She realized that sometimes life doesn't need a grand plan. Sometimes it only needs one brave moment, one leap of faith, to open the door to something beautiful. She looked up at the sky, whispering a quiet thank you to her grandmother, to the music, and to the small voice inside her that refused to stay silent. The city lights shimmered like tiny stars, and for the first time she felt she belonged, not to the world of the rich or the powerful, but to her own world, where dreams were still possible. Her story was only beginning. Days passed and life began to change in quiet but beautiful ways. The waitress, now a student once more, spent her mornings at the music academy and her evenings at the restaurant. She didn't want to quit her job. She still needed it, and she liked the honesty of it. It reminded her where she came from. But her world now had a new rhythm, one filled with melodies, laughter, and hope. Every morning she took the bus to the academy, sitting by the window, lost in thought. She carried her music notes in an old folder in a small packed lunch her mother made. When she arrived, she would walk through the tall glass doors, still half nervous, but a little more confident each day. The rooms were filled with sound, piano keys, violins, and voices, all blending into a harmony that made her heart flutter. At first, she felt out of place. The other students had polished shoes, fine clothes, and years of formal training. She came from a world where time was measured by shifts, not lessons. But her teachers never made her feel small. They saw her sincerity, her quiet fire. "You don't need to catch up," one teacher told her kindly. "Just keep being you. That's where your magic lives," so she practiced every single day. Sometimes she stayed late after class, playing until her fingers ached. The janitor would pass by, shaking his head with a smile. "You really love that piano," he'd say, and she'd answer softly, "It's like breathing." Her teachers noticed how her playing wasn't just technical, it was emotional. Every piece she touched carried feeling. She didn't play to impress, she played to speak. Slowly, word spread through the academy about the waitress with golden hands. One afternoon, the head of the academy called her to his office. "We're holding a small recital next month," he said. "Students will perform for guests and sponsors. Would you be willing to play?" Her eyes widened.
Me?
"Yes," he smiled. "You've earned it." She felt both excitement and fear rush through her chest. It would be her first time playing in front of a real audience since that night in the restaurant. But this time it wouldn't be by chance. It would be planned, expected. People would come to listen. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it." From that day, she practiced harder than ever. Every evening after work, she stayed an extra hour, going over each note until it felt perfect. Some nights, when the restaurant was empty, the manager let her sit at the grand piano again. "You started your journey here," he said once. "It's only right that you keep practicing here too." She smiled gratefully. The restaurant had become more than a workplace. It was the place where her second life began. As the day of the recital drew closer, she could feel the pressure building. Sometimes she doubted herself. She wondered if she truly belonged on that stage, surrounded by people who had grown up with opportunities she could only dream of. But then she'd remember her grandmother's words, "You feel the music." That was what made her different. The night of the recital arrived quietly but carried a weight that made her heart race. The Academy's concert hall was softly lit, filled with students, teachers, and guests in elegant clothes. The air buzzed with the kind of polite excitement that filled every seat. Backstage, she sat on a small bench, clutching her hands together. Her sheet music lay on her lap, though she already knew every note by heart. One of the other students smiled at her. "First time?" She nodded nervously. "Don't worry," he said kindly. "Once you start, everything else disappears." She smiled faintly. She hoped he was right. When her turn came, she walked onto the stage, her heart thudding against her ribs. The lights felt warm against her skin. She could barely see the faces in the audience, just a sea of shadows and glimmers. Somewhere in the middle row, she thought she saw her mother. She took a deep breath, sat down at the piano, and let her hands rest on the keys. For a moment, she didn't move. The room waited. Then gently she began to play. The first notes were soft, like a whisper. Then the melody bloomed, steady, flowing, full of emotion. Her nervousness melted away, replaced by calm. Her fingers moved naturally, as if they had known this moment all along. She wasn't performing for applause. She was sharing something honest, something pure. As the music filled the hall, a hush fell over the crowd. People leaned forward, listening closely. Every note carried a story of hardship, courage, and quiet strength. The sound was not loud or grand. It was simple, heartfelt, and true. When the final note faded into silence, the audience remained still for a moment, caught in the softness of it. Then, like a wave breaking, applause began to rise, gentle at first, then strong, echoing through the hall. She stood, her hands trembling slightly. She gave a small bow, her eyes shining with tears. It wasn't pride she felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude that life had given her another chance to stand where she once only dreamed of being. After the recital, people came to speak with her. Some were teachers, others were guests. One man, a well-known concert organizer, said, "You have a rare gift. Would you consider performing at our next event?" She froze, barely believing what she heard. I'd love to," she said softly. That night, as she walked home, the city lights seemed brighter than ever. The air felt fresh against her face. Every step she took carried a mix of disbelief and joy. At home, her mother hugged her tightly. "I heard the applause," she said proudly. "I knew you'd do it." The young woman laughed softly. "I was so scared," she admitted. Her mother smiled. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going anyway." In the days that followed, her life grew busier. Between work, study, and new invitations to perform, she barely had time to rest. But she didn't mind. Every tired moment felt worth it. One evening, after a long rehearsal, she returned to the restaurant to cover a late shift. The same group of elite guests from that unforgettable night happened to be there again. They recognized her instantly. "Look who it is," one of them said warmly. "The pianist who silenced us." The words were spoken with respect this time, not mockery. She smiled politely, still humble. "Good evening," she said, placing their dishes carefully. Another guest added, "We heard about your recital. Congratulations. You've come a long way." She nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I'm still learning." As she walked away, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Not revenge, not pride, but peace. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had already found her voice. Later that night, when the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, she sat once again at the grand piano. The manager leaned against the counter, watching silently as her fingers began to move. The melody was soft and familiar, filled with warmth. He smiled. "That's the song you played that first night." She nodded. "It's where everything began." He didn't say anything more, just listened. When she finished, the room was quiet again, filled with the same feeling it had on that night. Something gentle, unexplainable, almost sacred. She looked down at her hands, smiling faintly. They were the same hands that had once carried trays and wiped tables. Now they carried something else, dreams, hope, and music that touched hearts. She thought about how far she had come, not because of luck, but because she had chosen not to give up. Life had tested her, humbled her, and finally rewarded her courage. Before leaving, she placed her hand gently on the piano, whispering, "Thank you." That night, as she walked home under a quiet sky, she realized something important. Life had its own rhythm. Sometimes it slowed down, sometimes it rushed ahead, but if you listened closely, it always led you exactly where you were meant to be. She had started as a waitress, tired, unnoticed, and uncertain. But through a single act of courage, she had found her way back to the music that once gave her soul a voice. Her story was no longer just about struggle. It was about rising quietly, humbly, beautifully, and though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for sure: she would never stop playing. Weeks turned into months, and the young woman's life slowly transformed in ways she never imagined. The recital at the academy had opened doors she didn't even know existed. Every few days, someone new would reach out. Sometimes a teacher who wanted to mentor her. Sometimes a small event organizer asking if she would perform. But even with new opportunities, she stayed humble. Every morning, she still woke up early, helped her mother with breakfast, and took the same bus to the academy. She carried her old bag, still patched at the corners, and her sheet music neatly folded inside. She didn't want fame. All she wanted was to keep playing, to keep learning. One afternoon, her music teacher called her into his office. The man smiled as she walked in, gesturing toward a letter on his desk. "I have something for you," he said. "You've been invited to play at a charity gala downtown. It's a major event. Many well-known people will be there." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Me, but there must be other students more experienced than I am." He shook his head. "They asked specifically for you. Someone who heard you at the recital recommended your name." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the letter. The event was only 2 weeks away. She could hardly believe what she was reading. That night she barely slept. Her mind kept replaying the thought of performing at a grand hotel ballroom, in front of the very people she once served coffee to. The thought scared her, but it also gave her a strange sense of peace. Life had come full circle. Over the next days, she practiced endlessly. She chose a piece that meant something to her, a melody her grandmother once hummed while cooking, one she had turned into a full piano arrangement. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was honest. It carried emotion, history, and truth. As the day approached, she felt the old fears creeping back. What if she wasn't ready? What if she made a mistake? But then she reminded herself the piano had never judged her. Every note she played came from the same place, the heart. That was enough. When the evening of the gala arrived, the hotel glittered with lights. Cars lined the entrance, and guests in elegant gowns and black suits filled the marble hall. The air smelled of perfume and champagne. Waiters moved gracefully between the guests, balancing trays of delicate food. As she entered through the side door, she felt a wave of nervousness. She wasn't wearing a designer dress, only a simple blue gown her mother had carefully ironed. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her shoes were borrowed from a kind neighbor, but when she looked in the mirror backstage, she smiled softly. She looked like herself, and that was all that mattered. The ballroom buzzed with chatter as people took their seats. The stage held a single grand piano under soft light. She stood near the curtain, listening to the murmur of the crowd. Somewhere beyond that sea of voices were the same kind of people who once laughed when she brought them their drinks. And yet she wasn't angry. Tonight wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about music, about showing how far one dream could travel when it refused to die. When her name was announced, she walked to the piano slowly, the sound of her heels echoing through the silence. The audience turned toward her. For a moment, she could feel every eye in the room following her every step. She bowed gently, then sat down. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a heartbeat, time stood still. Then she began to play. The melody started softly, like a story being whispered. It was tender, almost fragile. Each note rose and fell like a memory. She played with her eyes closed, letting her hands move freely, guided by feeling rather than thought. The hall grew quiet. The noise of conversation faded away until there was nothing left but the sound of her piano. Even the waiters stopped moving, standing still to listen. Halfway through the piece, she felt something shift inside her. The fear melted away completely, replaced by calm. It wasn't just a performance, it was a moment of truth. All her years of struggle, all the long nights at the restaurant, the loneliness, the self-doubt, it all flowed through her fingers. As the final notes faded into silence, she opened her eyes. The room remained completely still. For a second, she wondered if she had done something wrong. Then slowly, the applause began. It started as a single clap, then grew louder until the entire room stood up, a standing ovation. She froze, her heart swelling with disbelief. Tears filled her eyes as she stood and bowed. She didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled. A small, honest smile that carried all the gratitude she felt. When she stepped backstage, her teacher was waiting for her. "You did it," he said proudly. "You moved them." She laughed through her tears. "I was terrified," he smiled. "That's how you know it mattered." After the performance, several people came to meet her. Among them was a gray-haired woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as the head of a music foundation. "Your playing touched me deeply," she said. "We support young musicians with talent and heart. I'd like to offer you a scholarship to continue your studies, abroad if you wish." The young woman was speechless. She couldn't even find the words to thank her. That night she returned home long after midnight. The streets were quiet and the air was cool. Her mother was waiting by the window, worry written on her face. When her daughter walked in, still wearing her gown, she jumped up. "How did it go?" The young woman smiled and said softly, "Better than I ever dreamed." They hugged tightly, tears of joy streaming down both their faces. Over the following weeks, news of her performance spread. Local newspapers wrote small pieces about the waitress who became a pianist. Her story began to inspire others, people who had once given up on their own dreams. Some would stop her in the street, thanking her for showing that it was never too late to start again. Despite all the attention, she remained grounded. She still helped her mother at home, still rode the bus, still practiced late into the night. The only difference was that now, she believed in herself. When the scholarship offer became official, she was invited to perform one last time before leaving for her studies. The event was smaller, more intimate, a farewell concert held at the same restaurant where everything began. The manager was thrilled. "Imagine that," he said with a grin. "From serving tables to performing on this very stage." That evening, the restaurant was full. Old regulars, her co-workers, even the same group of elite guests who had once mocked her, all came to listen. She wasn't nervous this time. She felt at home. As she sat at the piano, she looked around the room, the flickering candles, the warm faces, the familiar scent of coffee and baked bread. She smiled and began to play the same melody that had changed her life. The sound filled the restaurant, soft and glowing. People listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes. When she finished, the applause came not with noise but with warmth, like the embrace of an entire community. After the show, the woman who once mocked her approached with a shy smile. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. "You have something special." "I'm truly sorry." The young woman didn't hold any bitterness. She simply smiled and said, "Sometimes life teaches us lessons in unexpected ways." They shook hands, and in that moment, the past was finally at peace. Later that night, as she walked home for the last time before leaving the country, she stopped by the park near the bus stop, the same park where she once sat dreaming of something better. The stars shimmered faintly above, and the world felt still. She sat on a bench and closed her eyes, imagining her grandmother's voice, humming that same melody. "Keep playing," she could almost hear her say, "no matter where life takes you." And she smiled because that was exactly what she planned to do. The plane touched down just as the sun was rising, painting the sky with soft shades of gold. The young woman pressed her forehead against the window, her eyes wide with wonder. The city below looked like a dream, tall buildings, wide streets, and people rushing through the morning light. She could hardly believe she was really here, in another country, ready to begin a new chapter of her life. It had been months since the charity gala and the farewell concert at the restaurant. The scholarship had changed everything. She was now a student at one of the most respected music conservatories in the world. Her dream, once too far to touch, was suddenly real. The first few weeks were difficult. Everything was new, the language, the faces, even the air felt different. She often sat alone during lunch, missing home and the sound of her mother's voice. But each time she sat at the piano, all her fears disappeared. The music felt the same no matter where she was. It was her comfort, her connection, her home. Her teachers quickly noticed her dedication. She practiced longer than anyone else, often staying in the empty hall after everyone had gone. Some evenings, the janitor would find her still playing softly under the dim lights, lost in her own world. "You never stop," he once said kindly. She smiled. "Music doesn't let me." Her talent didn't go unnoticed. Soon she began performing at small student recitals. The audiences were different here, polite, quiet, but deeply moved by her playing. Each time she performed, more people wanted to know her story. They learned that she wasn't born into wealth or privilege. She had worked as a waitress, saving every coin she could, never letting go of her dream. Her story began to travel beyond the walls of the conservatory. One day, her teacher called her in and handed her a letter. "There's an international music festival next month," he said. "It's one of the biggest events of the year. The organizers heard about you. They want you to perform." She froze, staring at him in disbelief. "Me?" she whispered. He nodded, smiling. "You've earned this." The weeks that followed were filled with endless preparation. She chose a new piece, one she had been composing quietly for months. A blend of classical notes and the simple melody her grandmother once hummed. It was her way of bringing her past and present together. Every night she practiced until her fingers grew sore. Sometimes she would pause, close her eyes, and imagine the people who had helped her along the way. The restaurant manager who let her play, the teacher who believed in her mother who never stopped encouraging her. She felt their presence in every note. The day of the festival arrived at last. The concert hall was unlike anything she had ever seen. Massive, shining, filled with thousands of people from all over the world. Cameras lined the back rows and reporters whispered into microphones. She stood backstage, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what this moment meant. This wasn't just another performance. It was the result of every hardship, every sleepless night, every quiet prayer she had whispered when no one was listening. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The audience fell silent. She walked to the grand piano, her dress moving gently as she sat down. The lights glowed softly on her face. She rested her fingers on the keys and took a moment to breathe. The hall was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Then slowly, she began to play. The first notes were gentle, delicate like the whisper of dawn. Then the melody deepened, full of warmth and life. It rose and fell like a story unfolding. a story of struggle, of faith, of beauty born from pain. Her music carried the weight of her journey, from the small restaurant to this grand stage. As she played, she forgot about the audience, the cameras, the pressure. All she felt was the music flowing through her, guiding her, reminding her who she was. She didn't need to prove anything. She only needed to feel. Halfway through the piece, she closed her eyes, and for a moment, she was back home. The sound of her mother's laughter, the smell of food from the kitchen, the clinking of dishes in the restaurant, it all came rushing back. She smiled faintly as her hands moved effortlessly across the keys, carrying those memories with her. When the final note faded, the silence that followed felt endless. She opened her eyes slowly, tears glistening in them. The audience was motionless, their faces soft with emotion. Then, one by one, they began to rise, a standing ovation. The sound of applause filled the hall, echoing like thunder. People clapped, cheered, and some even wiped their eyes. She stood, bowed deeply, and smiled through her tears. For a brief moment, she looked up toward the ceiling, as if to thank someone unseen. After the concert, reporters and photographers surrounded her. They wanted to know everything, how she started, where she learned, what inspired her. But she answered humbly, her voice calm and gentle. "I just played what I feel," she said. I wanted people to hear hope. In the days that followed, videos of her performance spread across the internet. Millions of people watched, many leaving comments about how her music had touched their hearts. She received invitations to perform in cities she had never even heard of. Suddenly, the world seemed smaller, kinder, and full of possibilities. But despite all the fame and praise, she stayed grounded. She still called her mother every night, telling her everything. "It's beautiful here," she would say softly, "but nothing feels as warm as home." Her mother always replied, "Home will be waiting when you come back, my child. Keep shining." Months later, she returned home for the first time. The town hadn't changed much. The same narrow streets, the same small cafe where people gathered in the evenings. But now, people recognized her. They smiled, waved, and whispered with pride. The restaurant where she once worked had a small poster by the piano, her photograph from the festival stage. The manager greeted her with open arms. "You did it," he said warmly. "You really did it," she laughed softly. "We all did. This place gave me my first chance." That night, after the restaurant closed, she sat once more at the piano. The same old piano where everything began. She pressed a few keys, and the familiar sound filled the air. Her mother sat nearby, smiling quietly, her eyes shining with pride. "You remember the melody I used to hum?" her mother asked softly. She nodded. "I played it in front of the world." Her mother smiled wider. And they listened. The young woman began to play again. The same gentle tune that carried her from the shadows of doubt to the light of her dreams. The notes filled the small restaurant, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Outside, the night was calm. A few people passing by stopped to listen through the windows. For a moment, time stood still. As the final note faded, she looked at her hands. They were the same hands that once carried trays, wiped tables, and worked long hours without complaint. But now, those same hands carried music that could move hearts across the world. She realized something quietly profound. Dreams don't belong to the rich, the powerful, or the lucky. Dreams belong to those who keep going when no one believes in them. That night, before she left, she touched the piano gently and whispered, "Thank you." When she stepped outside, the air was cool and peaceful. She looked up at the stars and smiled. She wasn't the waitress who once hid behind trays anymore. She wasn't just the girl who played in secret after closing hours. She was someone who had found her voice and used it to bring light into the world. And as she walked down the quiet street, her heart was full, not of pride, but of gratitude. She knew the journey would never really end, because as long as she had her music, she would always have a reason to keep going. Her story had begun with silence, but it ended with a song. A song that reminded the world that even the smallest voice, if it dares to rise, can fill the largest room.